Hey guys, it's Mr. Arvites again. Welcome back, and we're going to be looking at some key factors that allowed for the United States to win the American Revolution. So let's start off first and look at the war itself. Geographically speaking, right, you're talking more than 5 to 6 week journey across the ocean for Great Britain. Sending that amount of troops over that time span and geographical distance was very difficult. This made this war extremely expensive. And then when you factor in France getting into the war in 1778, that really changed the whole dynamic. It created more of a global war. So one of the major factors that allowed for the United States to win this war was the fact that this was far away from Britain. The United States is fighting on its home soil. That was a clear advantage. And then the British simply could not afford to do this. Keep in mind, right, the actual taxes that caused the American Revolution are put into place because Britain is borderline bankrupt after the French and Indian War, another global war featuring France, right, and the New World. So Great Britain really couldn't afford to do this. And so that was a big time factor. So number two, we have to look at the PR standpoint of this, right? Public relations. The Army of the United States, right? The Continental Army did a much better job of keeping a good PR campaign going. No matter what the situation was, they tried to twist it into their own advantages. When George Washington lost in New York, newspapers wrote about the remarkable escape that he had from the British armies. When he lost Philadelphia, right, it was Ben Franklin who came in and said, General Howe hasn't captured Philadelphia. It is Philadelphia that has captured Howe, right? And these seem kind of like, simplistic and doesn't really matter, but in a lot of ways, it kept support going. George Washington and the Continental Army are able to keep morale going in the United States or in the colonies. Keep in mind, at any given point in the American Revolution, about a third of all people in North America support the British, and about a third are revolutionaries, leaving that other third of people kind of in the middle. And one thing that George Washington did with his army is he prevented them from seizing property from citizens. Now, they did at times, except they would usually try and pay for it, or they would get receipts, and there were various easier ways they did this. The British, on the other hand, tended to just wholesale seize stuff from farms. If they found out that people were supporting the army, they would burn their houses down. And this large-scale destruction created a lot of animosity for the British. They also had to factor in, the British brought in Hessian mercenaries, and these Hessian mercenaries from Germany weren't exactly popular amongst the colonists, right? They were looked at as barbaric, right? Going back to the classic Roman times of the Germans being barbarians. But the Hessians, even in the initial battle, right, at Long Island, massacred over 150 U.S. soldiers who had surrendered. And so the Hessians were looked at as these barbaric people who were, kind of just creating wholesale massacres. Meanwhile, the American army treated prisoners fairly well, or at least as well as you could in those situations. And so these types of things created a lot of good public sentiment for the United States, and that went a long way into keeping the Continental Army together and went a long way to keeping support for an elongated war, because this war lasted a lot longer than anybody thought. So reason number three, good young leadership. One of the things that makes, I think, George Washington a fairly remarkable person for his time is, while he is very aristocratic and he does believe in a lot of social structures from the old world, he was able to bring in people from different countries and different backgrounds and young people and empower them. And guys like Marquis de Lafayette come to mind. Alexander Hamilton, a lot of people know mostly because of the play, but Hamilton comes in as an artillery officer, right? This is an immigrant, right, from the Caribbean. And he comes in and becomes Washington's major aide-de-camp, and really he begins to write most of Washington's orders. And Hamilton is very much empowered by this, and Washington uses his talents to the utmost. Marquis de Lafayette from France is 22 when he comes over and ends up becoming one of the best generals that the American army has. He doesn't serve with the French army, he serves with the American army. That's a big difference. And another guy is Frederick von Steuben, the Baron, quote unquote, that Ben Franklin basically gave him the title, came from Prussia, and he served with Frederick the Great, but he came in as a quote-unquote general. He wasn't an actual general until he got to the American Army, but he helped rewrite the American Field Manual. He helped inspire and train American soldiers at Valley Forge and really created the more professional army that we see. Keep in mind, right, the American Army up until about 1777 is a ragtag group, and by 1778, we see a much more professional army develop, and one that can combat the British in the ways that they do. The next factor I think is really important is an unconventional war, right? The war itself was not a conventional war in terms of European standards. In Europe, you had large fields, you'd have these big time battles, right? And then you capture an army and you capture a city and there would be a peace treaty. Well, in this war, it wasn't fought like that. The majority of the battles in the American Revolution are actually very small, using less than 1,000 people on each side. And they're usually more skirmishes that take place in the small countrysides that go. There are large battles, and in the previous videos, we talked about some of these large battles. But really, I mean, once you get past 1778 with the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, George Washington won't fight in another large battle until Yorktown, which is in 1781. So you're talking a 3-year period of time where George Washington is more or less not fighting in large battles. Now, in the South, you'll have Nathaniel Greene, Marquis de Lafayette go down there, and they'll be chasing around Cornwallis. But again, it's going to be guerrilla warfare that really wins out. Because the colonies had a strength with these militias. These militias weren't exactly good on these large field combat operations, but the militias were good at small hit and run tactics, which is what they did in the French and Indian War. And so for the American Army, this unconventional style hit and run tactics and outlast your opponent became the big time focus of the war. George Washington also realizes about a year or two in that it doesn't really matter where the British are, so long as the army is there, we can win the American Revolution. And that is the big thing. The British never fully understood this. And really, if you look at the war itself, once you get to the seizure of Philadelphia, the British don't know what to do anymore because they own New York. They capture Philadelphia, though they're going to leave in 6 months. And at that point, they just don't have a clear-cut strategy. The two-pronged invasion in 77 failed largely because of unconventional war, right? The Battle of Saratoga, which is considered the turning point in the war in 1777, right? Upstate New York. You get Daniel Morgan, who's got his Virginia long riflemen, and they just decimate the officer corps, right? They absolutely destroy the officer corps of Burgoyne's army, and eventually leading to the victory Bemis Heights in the Battle of Saratoga, where they rout the British Army and surround them and cause Burgoyne to surrender, which is the largest British surrender until Yorktown. And that's an unconventional style of fighting. Washington's major victories, when you kind of look at them, are all unconventional, right? He has a big-time victory at Trenton and Princeton, and these are both nighttime operations where they circle around and use a little bit of trickery, and they do quick hit and run and get out, right? Battle of Monmouth Courthouse is kind of a normal battle, but really Washington uses a little bit of elements of surprise to get the British off guard, and that's how the battle kind of starts. So, using these kind of tactics, I think, is really important for the American Army. Even the Navy operates the same way. The United States didn't actually have an actual Navy, and that's hard to think of because right now we have the largest Navy on Earth. But at that point, the United States armed some merchant ships. We have John Paul Jones, who kind of sails out. He's really a pirate, right? He steals some British warships, and they begin to attack. And that's going to lead us to the next major factor, right? Which is going to be the involvement of foreign countries. The next major part is the involvement of foreign countries like France and Spain. In 1778, when France officially got into the war, right, by attacking British ships in the English Channel, it created a global conflict. This was something that Great Britain could not afford to be in. And so what it did is it stopped Great Britain from sending in reinforcements to North America and forced them to be on the defensive. And by and large, we see a limited amount of military operations for the rest of the war because they're fighting this war with France, and they're fighting it in the Caribbean. They're fighting it off the coast of the Atlantic. They're worried about a French incursion into Canada, which George Washington kind of prevents from happening, ironically. They're also worried about any invasions in actual, Europe. And then they're also fighting in India, which is going to be the next big place where they kind of compete with each other anyway. So you have fighting globally all around, and this is going to lead to, again, Great Britain, going back to a previous point, not being able to afford this global conflict, right? And that global conflict, I think, is something that's immensely important to understand, because the United States, if you go toe to toe with the British and everything's equal, we don't win the war. But you factor in these other things: geographic distance, a global aspect of the war, foreign aid. This is really important. We forget that the French gave the United States large amounts of arms, clothing, right? Ammunition, gunpowder, right? Once you get to 1779, the colonial army is actually well supplied with gunpowder, which it hadn't been previously. And there's also 10,000 French soldiers who are going to help out. And there's the entire French Navy. So these things are immensely important, I think, in this. Let's go to the last factor. The last, I think, real big key for the United States winning the war is going to be the political leadership, along with, I kind of combine two things: political leadership combined with the philosophical reasons for the war, right? The United States has the Declaration of Independence, this idea that you're fighting for freedom. Well, what does that mean? Is it really actually going to be freedom for everybody? Not really, but still it inspires people, right? It gets soldiers to enlist when they really probably should just go home. And then we talk about political leadership. I'm not even going to talk about the Continental Congress, because the Continental Congress was borderline inept. But when you look at people like Ben Franklin, who are in France securing, France has no reason to get in this war. It's going to cause the French Revolution, because France is also going to be bankrupt. But they do, and that's largely due to Ben Franklin's his negotiating skills. We look at guys, other Americans who are in Europe securing loans from the Netherlands, from the Russians, from the Spanish, getting them into the war. These are major factors. And then, of course, I think the big-time leader that gets the most credit is George Washington. And some people say too much credit, but I don't think he gets enough credit in a lot of ways. George Washington's steady leadership, while not great on the battlefield, is great politically. And he is the perfect person for the American Revolution. And when you think about George Washington, the most important thing he does in the American Revolution is probably the last act he does in the American Revolution. When the war is over and Great Britain has surrendered and everything is all said and done, George Washington has a bunch of different options, right? He has an army at his disposal. He's the most popular person in America, right? Who won a war with the British? There's a scoreboard. It's George Washington, everybody else zero, right? George Washington is going to retire, right? He retires at the height of his power when he could have been put in charge of everything, and that's what makes him rather remarkable. And that goes along with the philosophical purpose of this revolution: to get away from absolutism, get away from the old world, and bring in a new type of government. Now, it's going to take a little while for that government to get formed, right? We're going to have 5 more years till that Constitution starts to be written. But George Washington stepping away from the army in 1783 is probably one of the most important things that any American has ever done. And it led the way for the civilian government to take over. And if you look at revolutions that took place all around the world over the next 35, 40 years, almost all of them end with the general in charge becoming some sort of a leader or a dictator. And then they usually get executed. The French Revolution definitely is the epitome of that, right? Robespierre ends up becoming, put in charge. We have the Reign of Terror. He gets himself executed, and they go through a series of new governments. The United States doesn't have that process because the guy who could have taken that control decided to step down. Well, those are the factors that really led for the Americans to win the American Revolution, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, guys, take it easy.